Good evening, everyone. I'm Louise Mirror, New York Historical Society's president and CEO, and I am thrilled to welcome you to tonight's virtual program, The Words That Made Us, America's Constitutional Conversation, 1760 to 1840. I'm particularly grateful this evening for the wonderful support of Louis Jerome and JEMB Realty, who are sponsoring the program tonight. I'm also delighted to welcome guests of Lewis and JEMB and to thank you for your great partnership. Just before I introduce our speakers, I want to recognize and thank New York Historical Trustees who are joining us this evening. First and foremost, the outstanding chair of our Board of Trustees, Pam Schaffler, the chair of our Executive Committee, Richard Reese, and trustees Dorothy Goldman, Brian Kane, Suzanne Peck, Jean Reed, Cy Sternberg, and one of tonight's speakers, Akhil Reed Amar, who will be joining us momentarily on our virtual stage. I'd also like to thank members of our Chairman's Council. We are so very grateful to each and every one of you for your encouragement and support, especially at this challenging time. Now then, we are pleased indeed to welcome Akhil Reed Amar back to our virtual stage. He's Sterling Professor of Law and Political Science at Yale University. Before joining Yale's faculty, he clerked for Judge, now Associate Justice Stephen Breyer, when he was judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the First Circuit. Trustee Amar is also a regular visiting adjunct professor at Columbia Law School and the author of the recently released book, The Words That Made Us, America's Constitutional Conversation, 1760 to 1840. Joining us as moderator this evening is Richard Brookhiser, a senior fellow at the National Review Institute, a senior editor of the National Review, and the author of numerous books, including Give Me Liberty, A History of America's Exceptional Idea, and John Marshall, The Man Who Made the Supreme Court. He was historian curator for New York Historical's 2004 exhibition, Alexander Hamilton, The Man Who Made Modern America. I was delighted to be able to work with him back then. And in 2008, President George W. Bush awarded him the National Humanities Medal in a White House ceremony. Tonight's program will last an hour, including 15 minutes for questions and answers. Your questions can be submitted via the Q&A function on your Zoom screen. In the interest of simplicity, we've disabled the chat function tonight, so please do remember to use the Q&A. Our speakers will get to as many questions as time allows. And now I am happy indeed to turn our virtual stage over to tonight's speakers. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Louise. Thank you, Akhil, for joining us. It's always a pleasure and an honor to be at the New York Historical Society. It's always a pleasure to be with Professor Amar, who I'm going to call Akhil for the rest of the evening because he's a dear old friend and has been for years. And he's written this terrific book, America, The Words That Made Us, America's Constitutional Conversation, 1760 to 1840. And Akhil, your book covers a lot of things that you would expect to be covered in such a book. You talk about the Federalist Papers, you talk about the Constitutional Convention, but I think a lot of the real richness of this book and what impressed me so much about it is its richness, is things that are maybe less expected, maybe a little surprising. And I want to start with two words from your title and your subtitle. I want to start with words and conversation, which maybe isn't the first thing that people would think of when they think of the Constitution and its history and its development. So what conversation are you talking about? Who are the people in it? What kind of thing are they saying?
They begin as British subjects in the New World, and by talking to each other, in newspapers especially, but in letters, in face-to-face conversations, they talk themselves into becoming Americans. They begin to realize, whether they're up in Massachusetts or down in Virginia, or in still other colonies. My story begins in 1760. They begin to understand what they have in common with each other. They're talking to Britain initially. They see themselves at the beginning of my story as British subjects in the New World. They're trying to persuade their brothers and cousins and friends in Britain that Britain isn't treating them well. And yes, I think some people don't maybe focus on this idea of conversation, but the Constitution is a text, so it's words, of course, but it comes to life in a deed, in an ordainment, a constituting an act, and that act isn't just putting the document to a vote, an epic vote up and down the continent, a vote which more people were allowed to say yay or nay than had ever been allowed to vote on anything significant in world history. But it wasn't just a vote. It was a series of conversations. It was a dialogue. Some people were for the document, other people were against it. People in the middle were on the fence, and they were listening to both sides. And newspapers, you're a journalist, and newspapers and the print media are indispensable to this democratic ordainment project. So they're talking initially about becoming Americans. That will become the Declaration of Independence. And then eventually they talk themselves into becoming indivisibly Americans. One nation, indivisible, that's the Constitution. And they do it epically through words, through pictures, political cartoons, some very highfalutin stuff, the Federalist Papers, some really simple stuff, poetry, limericks, doggerel. It's an amazing, inclusive, robust, uninhibited, wide open, distinctly American experience.
So like a free-for-all, and it's not, so we're talking about more than just the big names. I mean, and you do cover them. You cover the people on the presidential placemats and the people in our wallets and in our, change purses. But this is a much bigger conversation, right? The cast of characters is much bigger than that.
It is. And so, for example, Act 1, Scene 1 is about someone. He's a pretty big name, but he's not a household name. James Otis. He's a firebrand of the American Revolution. He's New England's Patrick Henry, and John Adams would say he was Patrick Henry before there was Patrick Henry. I tell the story in that chapter of three people who are going to be significant over the next 15 years. My story starts in 1760-61. One of them is skeptical of these the people who will call themselves patriots. He actually is the most prominent loyalist, American-born loyalist on the continent by 1775. And what's stunning is that most people, even really well-read people, don't really know his name or don't really know his story. His name is Thomas Hutchinson. He's going to become the royal governor of Massachusetts, excuse me. When my story begins, he's lieutenant governor. He's American-born. If you had asked someone as late as 1770 or so, or definitely 1765, which of these two famous Boston-born smart people is going to end up supporting American independence, and who's going to end up siding with the king, Benjamin Franklin or Thomas Hutchinson, both Boston-born, both really smart. People might have said, "Oh, Franklin's going to end up supporting the king. His illegitimate son is the royal governor of New Jersey, and Hutchinson will side with his fellow New Englanders or something." So lots of people that are more obscure than Thomas Hutchinson, but I pick Hutchinson in particular because I want my audience to see there was another side, even to the American Revolution. If Thomas Hutchinson were alive today, and he wasn't a demon at all, my analogy would be he's Mitt Romney. He's Harvard educated. He's sober. He's a traditionalist. He believes in hierarchy. He loves his country, but his country is Britain, and he loves his hometown, which is Boston. And if he had been lucky enough to been born 20 years earlier, he wouldn't have had to pick between them, but he does. He ends up picking his king. So I do try to widen the cast of characters beyond the big six, the first four presidents: Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, plus of course Franklin and Hamilton.
Now you just mentioned cartoons, and you also mentioned Benjamin Franklin. So in a way, your title almost sells your conversation a little short, because it isn't just words, it's also images are involved in this. And tell us about this great cartoon that Franklin generates very early on in this conversation.
So he's such a genius. He invents bifocals. He invents the Franklin stove. He invents the lightning rod. He invents social institutions, the first secular university, a lending library, a philosophical association. But he also invents the world's first real political cartoon. It's not from Britain, not like Hogarth. It comes from America. Early on, America is a very democratic culture. It's simple. It's a picture. It's 1754. It's a picture of a snake that's cut up into pieces, and he has a slogan. It's the first viral meme. We could today say hashtag join or die. And in 1754, he says the colonies have to work together with the mother country, with Britain, to defeat the French in the back country. This is in the early stages of what will become the French and Indian War. And in that very same, on the very same page in 1754 of a newspaper, he's a newspaper magnate. If he were alive today, he might be Rupert Murdoch or something like that. On the very same page, that there's this picture of the snake, and this viral meme, hashtag join or die. In effect, he's also telling his audience about a young 22-year-old military officer from Virginia who bravely is confronting the French. His name is George Washington, and he's going to get his name in papers up and down the continent, 50 different references at age 22. And we're going to hear from him again. But that join or die cartoon, which is so simple, it's not high art, so it's easy to replicate. And cartoonists up and down the continent start to copy it, sort of like retweeting today, because printers don't really pay a lot for content yet. They're not paying scribblers like you and me to write stuff. They're basically publishing. Yeah, it's bad. They're publishing proceedings of local assemblies, grand jury pronouncements, judicial opinions, but also republishing things that have appeared elsewhere. If you're in New York, reprinting something from Philadelphia or Boston or London. And this join or die image goes viral first in 1754. But then 10 years later, when the colonies are beginning to unite against London, it has a rebirth, and it's going to lead to the Stamp Act Congress, where the colonies do join together. And then 10 years after that, it has a rebirth. The snake, he hibernates, and then he reawakens. He's like a phoenix. And in 1774, he reawakens for the Continental Congress, the first Continental Congress back in Franklin's Philadelphia, which is going to involve joining against Britain, and if you don't join, you will die. And eventually, this meme is going to be the single best Federalist argument for the Constitution. We have to hang together, otherwise Britain will cut us to pieces, or France, or Spain. It's a geostrategic argument for an indivisible union. And my God, Franklin is seeing a version of that, a more British version of that, as early as 1754. He puts it in a simple picture that ordinary people can understand, and 3 simple monosyllabic words that make a powerful political argument: join or die. He's inventing, avant la lettre. He's imagining Twitter or just it's how many characters? It's not even 140. It's Instagram. It's amazing. It's Snapchat.
230 characters left. Join or die. You could have said a lot more, but he's smart enough to stop where he's ahead. We want to get back, obviously, to George Washington, but you've raised here a very important point. I think this is one of the most striking points you make, which is that America's constitutional development and its conversation isn't just happening entirely within our own borders. It's also being impacted over and over again by the world. And talk to us more about that. What does our position in the world have to do with our thoughts about how we govern ourselves? I mean, we're protected by oceans, right? Or wrong?
Well, we are if we join together. If we don't, we're going to have land borders between South Carolina and North Carolina and Georgia and Maryland and Pennsylvania, the Mason-Dixon line, and Pennsylvania and New York, and so on. So the genius of Franklin is to understand, and eventually Washington and Hamilton, that the Atlantic Ocean will be an amazing moat that will protect us against the old powers of Europe, but only if we unite and we don't fight each other, and we don't, where Europe can actually play us off against each other in divide and conquer fashion. If we have a united policy toward the West and make it an American domain, a national domain, and not just Virginia's backyard or Pennsylvania's territory, or Connecticut even wants a piece of what becomes Ohio. So the Western Reserve. So yes. Americans, as early as 1754, Franklin and Washington are beginning to see the possibility of a world at war. And the Constitution comes out of, our revolution is a part of a larger global struggle. So our audience is very impressive, very sophisticated. Historically, of course, if you asked them when did the First World War start, they would say, oh, it started in 1914 in the European Balkans. No, it started in 1754 in America's backcountry, when a young officer named George Washington gets involved in confrontation between the two great superpowers of the world, France and England. And that's going to eventually, the things that happened in 1754 connected to join or die, and a thing called the Albany Congress, in which some of the colonies get together, is going to become the world's first global war, sucking in the two great powers, the two greatest powers, and other European powers get involved in the action. And this war, which we call the French and Indian War, the rest of the world calls the 7 Years' War, is going to involve conflict on multiple oceans and multiple continents in the New World and the Old World simultaneously. It's going to culminate in a massive redrawing of the global map. Canada will move from the French column into the British and column. And no conflict in world history before had ever involved multiple continents, new and old, New World and Old World, multiple oceanic struggles. It's the First World War, and at the same time, it's generating that world war, a world conversation, because warships can move troops more quickly than ever, but trade ships can move newspapers back and forth more easily than ever. And London newspapers are being read in Boston, and Boston newspapers are being read in London, and both of them are being read in Philadelphia and New York City and Charleston. So you're beginning to have actually a genuine world conversation, and it's a conversation about constitutional first principles, like what should be the rules for the empire. And Britain's having won Canada is going to have to pay for this really expensive war. And they think it's only fair that Americans chip in. They're the big beneficiaries. We've just gotten rid of a huge French threat to the British colonies. So they're going to start imposing taxes immediately after war's end. The 7 Years' War conventionally begins in 1757, ends with a Treaty of Paris in 1763. But in the aftermath of that, to pay for that war, Britain's going to try to tax America, and that's going to eventually lead to the American Revolution. And the American Revolution is going to be the continuation of a world war, because eventually France is going to jump back in. And again, our audience might not know, even though they're really sophisticated, the American Revolution, the War for Independence, was one part of a larger global struggle. Britain has to defend far-flung colonies in India and in Africa. It has to keep troops at home so that French won't invade. We might think we won the Battle of Yorktown. Well, there were 2 French fighters for on land and sea for every American. Even at Yorktown, we were part of a larger world struggle. And at the time, we're puny. 3 million Americans, 10 million Brits, 30 million French folks.
Well, and Washington, in a way, starts all this with his frontier fracas when he's 22. But by Yorktown, he's there commanding the American army. And then in the next decade, he will become the first president of this new country. And you have him, and you praise him as a constitutional thinker. And this might strike people as a little odd. I mean, you know, we know George Washington was a great man. We think of him as a great general, obviously. We think of him as a great executive, but he didn't write any Federalist Papers. He didn't write the Declaration of Independence. He was at the Constitutional Convention, but he hardly said anything. And yet you identify him as a very important constitutional thinker. So what is his contribution to this conversation, and how does he make it?
Substantively and methodologically, he is the indispensable man. Without him, there's no constitution that looks remotely like the one that we have. So first, let's take this idea of conversation, the method point. People have to speak in a conversation, but you need someone to listen. And Washington, he's not a great scribbler. You know, he's not a big talker or a great a writer of pamphlets, but he's a very good listener, and he brings people who disagree and listens to both sides. As president, he's going to have Hamilton on his right and Jefferson on his left. In the war, he has war councils, and he listens to his advisors. And actually, he is a good generator of words, but he doesn't write op-eds or pamphlets. He writes letters to people. He's a wonderful correspondent, and his correspondence in turn, pun intended, they're like network correspondents today. They're giving him intelligence, information from all parts of America, and eventually even from across the water. He's asking Lafayette what's happening in France. And Rochambeau. So he writes more and receives more letters than just about anyone other than Thomas Jefferson, I think. And our audience can confirm this by looking at the National Archives Founders Online Database, which is free to everyone and word searchable. You'll just see how many letters go back and forth to Washington. So he's a wonderful listener. He's unanimously elected president. Every single elector votes for him, even the people who vote against the Constitution vote for Washington. He's unanimously reelected, in part because he's trying to listen to everyone and unify the country and hold it together. He's a symbol of union. Now, substantively, now I'm moving from the method that he listens to everyone and he's sober. And John Adams, we love John Adams, you and I. You wrote a great book on the Adams family, but John Adams is not always the world's best listener. And you might think, oh, Jefferson's great. Thomas Jefferson is so ideological, he can't hear what he doesn't want to hear. Sound familiar? Because we have that problem today. And I'm so impressed that Washington, who doesn't have strong ideological commitments, just says, like, let's get to the facts. You know, I want to hear both sides carefully, and then I'll make up my mind. So Jefferson's not the world's best listener. And John Adams is not the world's best listener. And some of these people, they're better at projecting. But now, what's Washington's substantive idea? Union. He, just like Franklin, understands join or die. And on the very page that join or die appears in May 1754, on that same page, there's actually a reference to the young officer, George Washington. This is Benjamin Franklin talking about George Washington at age 22. He understands from a military point of view that unless the colonies hang together, now independent states in 1776, they're done for. So his he is a continentalist. And who's at his right hand throughout the American Revolution, basically, or pretty early on? Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton, to borrow a phrase, Alexander Hamilton, American. This is Rick Brookhiser's book. Alexander Hamilton isn't just about Massachusetts the way John Adams might be, or Virginia the way Thomas Jefferson or James Madison. Alexander Hamilton doesn't have just a singular loyalty to any one state, although he ends up coming to New York. He comes from abroad. He loves America as a whole. He helps summon it into existence. And so the key idea is union, join or die, national security. And if we don't create an indivisible union, which is what Washington is advocating in the early 1780s, and so is Hamilton in a series of essays called The Continentalist, they will become the first 8 Federalist Papers, which are far more influential than anything that Madison wrote, like the Federalist 10. And they make a geostrategic argument for union. And if we can hold together, then yes, we can have a huge moat called the Atlantic Ocean. We won't need a big army. It'll be hard for the old powers of Europe to kill us as long as we don't kill each other. We got to get rid of land borders, create an indivisible union like the Union of Scotland and England. So Britain had 10 million people and they beat France with 30 million people. How do they do that? In part because they have good capital structure, banks and things like that. Washington understands banks, so does Hamilton, Jefferson, and Madison, not so much. But also this strong indivisible union between England and Scotland, that's going to be the model for the more perfect union of America. Because when England and Scotland are different kingdoms, they're fighting each other, and Mel Gibson is coming down and whomping on the English, and Mary Queen of Scots is getting involved. And that's not what conduces to liberty. Union will lead to liberty. That's Washington's theme. First, last, always. He has an army on the continent after Yorktown. He's the only one who really has an army. He gives it up. He doesn't make himself king. He could, or emperor. He could have, but he understands that liberty and union are one and inseparable. He says that during the Revolutionary War. He says that actually in a letter that accompanies the Constitution itself, saying we got to move beyond state sovereignty. He says that in his farewell address, written by largely Hamilton. So he listens to everyone, and his big idea is we are all Americans. He's a Southerner who understands the North and who spent time in the West. He is the embodiment of American union. And the Continental Army is really the only genuinely continental institution that exists. The Continental Congress, the Confederation Congress, is very localist, basically. So Washington is the embodiment of America. He is Franklin's snake.
And there's another Virginian, another veteran, who you also link to Washington and to Hamilton, who outlives both of them by, not only outlives them, but stays in office many years after they're gone. And that's John Marshall. And what is his role in this conversation?
So you mentioned to the audience that we're friends, and one of the things that I'm most proud of, because I'm proud of my work as an author, but I'm also proud of my work as a muse. I try to inspire other authors, my favorite authors, and I try to learn from my favorite authors. So both you and I really respect Gary Wills, who's interested in images, for example, in Cincinnatus, and so I do that with cartoons. Okay, but I encouraged you early on to write a book about Lincoln. There are only 18,000 books that are written, but I said, but we need another one by you, Lincoln's relationship to the founding. And I love that book. And I even helped you, I think, with the title, founder's son.
You did.
I gave you a title. I then told you, oh, write about John Marshall. And you did, and it's a brilliant biography. You didn't use my title, though. My title for that one was The Last Founder. And yes, actually, Madison outlives Marshall by a few years, but Madison's been out of office, since 1817. Okay, so and he dies in 1836, Marshall predeceases him, but Marshall is in office as the Chief Justice for 34 years or so. So he is the last founder in that he is continuing to have an impact into the 1830s, whereas Madison's out of Hamilton. So Franklin dies in 1790. And Washington dies in 1799, doesn't see the new century, and Hamilton's killed in a duel in 1804, and famously Adams and Jefferson are going to die on July 4th, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. But throughout all of this, Marshall is in power, and what is he doing? He's vindicating Marshall's vision. He's the great nationalist carrying forward that continentalist flag of George Washington, with whom under whom he fought at, with whom he served at Valley Forge. And if you were at Valley Forge with Washington and Hamilton, as Marshall was, you understand that we need money, we need to support the troops. If we don't, we're dead. Adams wasn't there. Jefferson wasn't there. Madison wasn't there. They don't feel it in their bones the way Marshall does. He's a great nationalist, and he carries forward the vision. He has immense respect for Washington. He's Washington's first biographer before Parson Weems, and he has immense respect for Hamilton, who is a brilliant lawyer, and Marshall uses Hamilton's legal ideas about the bank and many other things. And one other thing that he does, he's a nationalist figure also in being a good listener. I talk about the relationships between some of the founders. So Jefferson and Madison team up, and Adams makes enemies. He's a loner. He teams up only with Abigail, but he first hates Thomas Hutchinson, and then he's going to feud with Hamilton, even though Hamilton was trying to help him, in various ways. And he starts off friendly with Jefferson, but then they become, rivals. And so teams are important. Jefferson and Madison team up. Hamilton and Washington team up. And Marshall finds a teammate, the great Joseph Story. And the teams in America work particularly well when they combine North and South, and in particular, Massachusetts and Virginia. Okay, so Marshall is Virginia, Story is Massachusetts. Think about all the other Virginia, Massachusetts teams. Rhetorically, James Otis from Massachusetts and Patrick Henry from Virginia. Your first president, vice president are going to be George Washington and John Adams, and they worked together in 1776. And by the way, so did Jefferson and Adams, again, a Virginian and a Massachusetts person. Adams's vice president is a Virginian, Thomas Jefferson. One of Jefferson's vice presidents is a Massachusetts guy, Elbridge Gerry, and he's also going to be one of Madison's vice presidents. So the North-South team of Massachusetts and Virginia is important. So the answer to your question about John Marshall is he's the last founder. He strengthens the judiciary. He's a Washington man, a Hamilton man, a continentalist, and he finds a partner from another region. He and Story together make a really impressive team, just as Washington and Hamilton do, and just as Madison and Jefferson do.
I think it's fair to say that both of us, if we're not exactly members of the Federalist Party, we're very sympathetic to it. And, this has been animating our talk for the last few minutes. But say a good word for Thomas Jefferson. I mean, you said some critical things, and I agree with what you said, but after all, he's who he is. So what does he add that was precious.
So let me begin by saying, as a young person, I adored Jefferson and was very skeptical of Hamilton. And you and other people changed my ideas about Hamilton. Levin Miranda very powerfully changed my idea. Ron Chernow, they're dedicatees of the book, but Rick Brookhiser, as much as anyone, changed my idea about Hamilton. And if my idea about Hamilton rises, then Jefferson is going to maybe fall corresponding. But if you had asked me at age 20, we were at Yale College together, I would have said to you, Rick, if I'm lucky enough ever to have a son, I'm going to name him Jefferson. So my views about Jefferson have changed, but you asked me to say a good word about him, especially the young Jefferson. He's such an idealist. He dreams of a world that could be better. He's the architect of what will become a Northwest ordinance that proposes initially to end slavery, not just in the Northwest, but in all Western territory. And he dreams of an America that's open to talent. He's gonna help smart kids who aren't born privileged to be able to rise because of their native ability and academic aptitude. He inspires ordinary people with his belief in ordinary people, and Thomas Hutchinson, for all his impressive attributes, doesn't get the common man quite. He's a little too sort of stiff and hierarchical, and Thomas Jefferson does. From a geostrategic perspective, thank goodness, he says lots of silly things, truthfully. But when he's president, when he's actually in power, he doesn't do silly things. He tends to do smart things. And one of the smartest things he ever does is double the land mass of the United States. The Louisiana Purchase is an epic achievement. It's completely
firing a shot.
Yes, it's completely consistent with this geostrategic idea. And I'm not sure that the Federalists could have done that quite, because the French like Jefferson. He likes the French. He's wonderful at buttering people up. He's got so much politesse and so I'm not sure Napoleon would have ever done that deal with John Adams, because John Adams might have found a way to annoy. He did find ways to annoy Napoleon, because he's so blunt and such a blunt-spoken Yankee. So wow, he founds a political party. You and I have to respect people who are good at what they do. And he actually pretends he's not appalled, but he really is. Madison is more openly political. They make an amazing political partnership, and they create a dominant political machine that will basically whip the Federalists. Oh, and he champions free speech. Really important. John Adams doesn't get free speech. Thomas Jefferson gets it a lot. His partner Madison gets it even more, and they champion freedom of speech against the Sedition Act, against John Adams. They're going to form a political party that will be the dominant political party all the way to Abe Lincoln. So you and I, as people who are political observers, have to respect that. He creates a newspaper empire of affiliated sort of newspapers that support his way of thinking about the world, and he secretly funds folks in various ways. He's, in that respect, he creates Fox News Network. Avant la lettre, an affiliate. So he understands the democratic newspaper culture of America. He's always telling Madison, go write some op-eds against Hamilton. Rip him to shreds. He's too good a newspaper scribbler. You gotta go after him. So Thomas Jefferson. There's a reason the guy's on Mount Rushmore. Now, I criticize him because on something that's really important to me, the slavery issue, he gets worse over time. He founds a political party that's basically has a Southern base. Here's the relevance of this today. Today, there's a party, both parties have this, but I'm going to talk about the Republican Party. I'm with Liz Cheney. I think in the end, you have to protect the soul of your party, the conscience, and you can't give in to big lies. And so I respect her for that. But I see the pull on the other side, but we're going to lose votes. We're going to lose our base if you're Lindsey Graham or Kevin McCarthy. That's a similar thing that confronts Madison and Jefferson. They know slavery is wrong. They know it in their hearts. They know it in their bones. But in order to defeat John Adams, who's made criticism of John Adams a crime in the Sedition Act, they have to create a party. And that party has a Southern base. And they, because they are politicians, say, okay, that's the political bed we made, and we're gonna lie in it, and that's our part. And if it requires some compromises, okay. And so they get worse on slavery, even though deep in their bones they know it's wrong. And I respect their idealism, but in order to keep their political machine operative, they become increasingly pro-slavery. They actually, and this is a story that I tell that isn't told by their biographers in general, Dumas Malone, our friend Jack Rakove, or Noah Feldman. You tell it better than anyone else in your book on James Madison. You say, ooh, on slavery, Madison disappoints. I add to that, he's getting worse over time. He actually, at the end of his life, says, oh, let's send slaves out into the West, as if like spreading the virus will somehow cure the virus, which is the opposite of what Jefferson and Madison said early on. Let's prevent slavery spread in the West. And that's what's going to actually trigger the Civil War eventually, is slavery in the West. So Washington gets better on slavery as time goes on. He realizes it's wrong, and in his last will and testament, he provides for the freeing of the slaves. Jefferson doesn't, Madison doesn't. Franklin gets better on slavery as time goes on, and his last act, in the last chapter, I basically have the last scene for all of them, you know.
Tell that last story of Franklin before we get to questions, because it's so Franklin-esque and it's so funny, and it's just a great story. People ought to.
I talk about these great men, and in my last scene, I kill them all off. I basically give you the death scenes, you know, dramatically. You know, I love them, but they did die. And so, but I tell you how each one in death, there's some deep idea there. And for both Washington and Franklin, the deep idea, their rosebud on their dying breath, is basically emancipation, abolition. We should get rid of slavery. And Washington does it. He's a quiet guy. He doesn't make a big scene about it. He does it as a business person, a plantation owner, by providing for the freeing of his own slaves, a mini emancipation proclamation. Now, who's Franklin? He's a newspaper guy. He loves, and he's a satirist. So he actually first proposes to Congress, he writes a petition as head of an anti-slavery and abolition society that Congress should do, to the maximum extent possible, Congress should try to diminish slavery. And the people from Georgia and South Carolina don't like that, and they rail against Franklin. And one guy actually says, like, what does Ben Franklin know about the Constitution? You know, nothing. So Franklin writes a spoof. And he's brilliant at satires. Anonymously, he's brilliant at cartoons, but he's brilliant at, and satires, you see, they appeal to a democratic culture. It's tongue in cheek, and he writes as if he actually says, well, you know, some of the arguments that I just heard about why we should preserve slavery made by the Georgians and the South Carolinians put me in mind of something that happened 100 years ago. There was this Arab slaveholder who actually was defending the enslavement of the infidel Christians. And every single argument that the Georgians made about enslaving Black people, he says, he makes this up, of course, was made by basically, you know, African Arabs for enslaving white European Christians. Oh, someone has to do the work, and they don't believe in God, and they're better off here than they are in their homeland, and who wants to intermarry with lesser blood, and Holy Scripture authorizes this, and actually this is good for them. It's a positive. So he takes every one of the Georgian arguments, flips it around racially. And what he's really, of course, and it's a brilliant spoof. It's the same guy, 16 years old, pretended he was a middle-aged matron named Silas Dogood. At 16 years old, Franklin spoofs, punks his own brother, who runs the newspaper and doesn't realize that Franklin has created this fictional character. And he does it at the end, and he knows that he's dying. And so he knows that America will eventually recognize this is his dying message to America. Do we want to actually, in 100 years, still be defending slavery the way 100 years ago slavery was defended when people who were enslaved were European Christians?
Right, and one of the funniest things about that, he claims that this is in some book, that was written 100 years ago, the memoirs of some English diplomat to Algiers or someplace. And people in Philadelphia actually went to booksellers and said, "Do you have a copy of so-and-so's book?" Which Franklin had made up, but it was so well done that the tongue was so firmly in cheek. Okay, now we have some questions coming. Here's one. Very pertinent to what you've been saying. How did literacy of the American people evolve between 1760 and 1840? In other words, how literate were we? Were we getting more literate? Were we already literate in 1760? Obviously, there's got to be a base here. All this newspaper writing and letter writing is going to fall on sterile ground.
It's spectacularly widespread among whites, female as well as male. And partly it's because America is a Protestant culture, and Protestants believe deeply, especially the Americans, especially in New England, which is particularly Puritan, but even in places like Virginia, which is more Cavalier and Anglican, whereas New England is kind of more Puritan Roundhead, English dissenters. But if you're a Protestant, you believe you have to read the Bible. Sola scriptura, and Americans do read their Bible, and even someone as late as Andy Jackson, and I have good words to say about Andy Jackson on some things. He believes in indivisible union, and Lincoln is going to stand on Jackson's shoulders in resisting secession, Jackson in the nullification crisis. But Andy Jackson is self-taught. How is he self-taught? He goes to church every Sunday and listens to people preach in the pulpit, preach from the gospel, from the Bible. So it's a Bible reading, Bible discussing culture. Very famously, someone like Jonathan Edwards, whose grandson is going to be named Aaron Burr, publishes his sermons, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. So even in 1760, remarkable literacy rates among whites. By 1790, America has, I think, more newspapers and newspaper readers per capita than any country in the world, including Britain. And certain technological developments are going to facilitate that. So when you get, for example, the Erie Canal, you can actually now go all the way around America, just like you can go all the way around Britain. You can go from Chicago, across the Great Lakes to Buffalo, then across the Erie Canal to Albany, down the Hudson to New York, then all around the Florida coast, all the way up to over to New Orleans, and then up the Mississippi to Chicago. So letters can travel faster, ships can travel faster. Eventually, of course, you're going to get railroads by the end of my time period, 1840. It's a remarkable letter writing. And who is Franklin? He's a postmaster. Okay, all these guys are newspaper guys, so 5 of them are newspaper scribblers, and the 6th, George Washington, reads more newspapers than anyone around. But they're also letter writers, and our audience can read these letters free online. The National Archives Founders Online has every letter word searchable to and from every major founder. And so a remarkably literate culture, and that includes women too. Let me say one thing, because we haven't talked about women, and I feel bad about that. So I said Adams does have a partner, and her name is Abigail, and she's amazing. And because Adams is a public servant, and he sacrifices himself virtuously for his country, he's away from Abigail for a long time. Because he's away, for example, off in France, there are lots of letters back and forth. If they had been in the same place, happily, they would have loved to be in the same place. They really love each other and respect each other. And she's really smart and fun to read. But because they're separated, we have amazing letters back and forth between Abigail and John, and between Abigail and everyone else, between everyone and everyone else, because it's really a highly literate culture and a newspaper culture.
Now, one questioner asks about linguistic diversity in the early United States. And there were a lot of German speakers. Did these documents, to what extent were they translated into German language newspapers?
So because I don't speak German, I didn't look at that, but 1/3 of Pennsylvanians at the time of the Declaration of Independence are native German speakers. And German newspapers are really important. And as late as I think the first Congress, there's discussion about translating congressional proceedings, at least in Pennsylvania, into German. The Muhlenbergs, one of them is Speaker of the House. I can't remember if it's Frederick or Augustus. There are a couple of them. And you may know, because of our mutual friend, Harold Holzer, who's a great friend of the New York Historical Society, that our man Lincoln is the secret owner of a German language newspaper in Springfield, Illinois, and German language speakers are about 10% of the population of Springfield, and they're all pro-Lincoln because secretly he's the owner of this newspaper that's always saying nice things about Lincoln. By the way, Lincoln at a freakishly early age. Okay, he doesn't have books in his home, but he reads every scrap of paper and he reads newspapers wherever he can find them. And early on, he's writing op-ed after op-ed anonymously. So many of them are partisan op-eds because the newspapers back then had a partisan affiliation, many of them, more like the National Review today or the New Republic or the Nation. They're ideological newspapers. I think the New York Times is actually on one side and the Wash Post basically.
They were openly so.
Yeah.
They were openly so. They didn't pretend not to be.
Yeah. So Lincoln reads newspapers and writes op-eds, but he also owns a German language newspaper, and especially, yes, there were German language newspapers. I have hundreds of citations to newspapers. That's one of the big things in the book, and it's not because I'm better than the folks that came before. It's because until 10 years ago, 5 years ago, they weren't online and word searchable. And now they are through a database that every academic can get for free called America's Historical Newspapers. So I don't have to go to 40 different cities and find moldering piles of newspapers. I can just find them online. But the truth is, I didn't really look at too many of the German language newspapers, which are around because I don't speak German.
One questioner is asking about the religious diversity in America during this period, and is that a problem or is it somehow a benefit?
It's a challenge, and Madison is going to theorize that very powerfully in Federalist 10, building on experience even in Virginia as between the Baptists and the Anglicans, the Episcopalians. But today we say, oh, well, they're basically all Christians. I promise you, it only takes two to kill each other over for centuries, and any two things will do. Protestants and Catholics will do. For 100 years, there's religious warfare in Central Europe over angels and pinheads and Protestants and Catholics, but any two will do. Catholics and Protestants, Christians and Jews, Jews and Muslims, Muslims and Hindus, any Shia and Sunni, Sunni and Sufi, any two will do. And America has way more than two. They've got Congregationalists up in New England, free thinkers in Rhode Island, descendants of Anne Hutchinson, who is the great-great-grandmother of Thomas Hutchinson, by the way, and Roger Williams. So free thinkers in Rhode Island and some Baptists, Congregationalists in New England, Virginia, New York is very polyglot, sort of many different Quakers in Pennsylvania and Delaware, a lot of Anglicans, especially in Virginia and the Carolinas. And then there are going to be new sects by the time of 1840, the Shakers and the Methodists and more Baptists coming on board. Baptists are important in Virginia, and Madison befriends the Baptists in particular. So that's a lot of religious diversity, and that's going to initially be a stumbling block. I haven't mentioned Catholicism. There are Catholics in Maryland, but America, for geostrategic reasons, think we have to hang together. In 3 words, join or die. So much so that the first Confederation Congress actually writes a letter to the Quebecois saying, hey, why don't you join us? Even though we've recently fought a war against you, the French and Indian War. And even though you're Catholic and we're Protestant and you're French speaking and we're English speaking, geostrategically, it's, you know, it's going to be useful for us to have you on board so you don't stab us in the back while we're fighting, you know, the Brits on the coast. And so they sent him a nice letter in effect saying, this is like, you know, EU membership. You've been, or like a credit card. You get this letter. You've been pre-approved for a gold card, you know, with American Express or MasterCard or whatever. And the Quebecois, the Canadians say, thanks, but no thanks. And we don't really, and so Americans try to actually conquer Montreal and Quebec, and Benedict Arnold comes close, but fails. Religious diversity is one of the things that's going to make it hard for Americans to join or die. 13 different colonies founded at different times for different reasons. Virginia is basically about making money, and Massachusetts is basically about religious freedom. And so when my story begins in 1760, they are not Americans. They are Virginians and South Carolinians and Massachusetts men. But because of newspapers, because the British try sort of treat them all kind of pretty badly with the Stamp Act and later the Coercive Acts, through newspapers, they talk themselves into being Americans and basically say to themselves, okay, there's a lot of religious diversity, but you know what? That can be a strength rather than a weakness. And that's where Madison's Federalist 10 comes in. Religious diversity can be a strength. Now, in fact, at the time, not very many people paid attention to Federalist 10. The main argument was the geostrategic one of Washington and Hamilton and Franklin, the join or die idea. But religion is going to be a stumbling block because people are going to wonder. Now, and here's one final thing. I don't know if I told you, the two places in the world that are pretty self-governing and free are the Brits after the Act of Union and the Swiss. And the Swiss don't have a single language. They got 4, Swiss Deutsch, German, Italian, French. They don't have the same religion. They're Protestants and Catholics. So how do they hang together? What makes Switzerland work? Why is it working democracy? You know, we've got actually Catholics and Protestants even, and high and low church people in Britain. Here's what the Federalist says, especially the Federalists say, defensible borders is what works. England's an island, so you only need a navy that's defensible. The Swiss, even though they got Protestants and Catholics, they've got a defensible border called the Alps. If we can create a continental union, join or die, hang together, we'll have a defensible border called the Atlantic Ocean. We won't need a big army that will be threatening to liberty. We just need a navy, just like the English Navy has to be able to beat the Spanish Armada, but navies are less threatening to people in the coast and in the hinterlands. They're less threatening to liberty. So that's the idea, that geostrategically we are one people, even though religiously we're not quite one. But hey, it's worked for the Swiss, so we can make it work for America. And the Federalist Age talks about the Swiss and the British example.
Okay, just a brief time for a last question, but it's an interesting one. The Constitution never mentions 2 political parties. And yet very soon, lo and behold, there were 2 political parties.
And that's the story that I tell about when these former friends and allies, Jefferson and Adams, who worked together in 1776, begin to diverge, and Adams makes it a crime to criticize Adams. And in response, the Sedition Act, and in response, and by the way, Marshall doesn't join Adams in that, and to Marshall's credit, that he never is all in on the Sedition Act. But in response to that, Jefferson takes a loose coalition and turns it into a much more organized political party, and it will become a kind of a permanent political party. And the seeds of a 2-party system, a strong 2-party system, emerge after Washington passes from the scene. Remember, he's unanimously elected, and you're going to get the seeds of that in the contest between Jefferson and Adams, and it's going to be constitutionalized in a 12th Amendment that's designed to make the Electoral College safe for a 2-party system. I won't go into all the details now, but I promise in the book I do.
And we still have Jefferson and Madison's party still walks among us. It
It does,
changed its name. They called it the Republicans, and then it became the Democrats. But oldest party in the world, isn't it? Except maybe the Tories. Tories may be older.
It is, and one of the things that I actually said about your book on Madison is I thought it was a spectacular biography because it captures Madison as a Paul. He was a Paul. He had no other job basically except public service. Hamilton was a lawyer. Washington was a general and a surveyor and a business person, and Jefferson actually dabbled in law, and Franklin was a printer. This is the only thing that Madison does. He's a Paul from start to finish. And he's a party guy. He's creating a party. He's not that different than Martin Van Buren or Mark Hanna or Mitch McConnell or Lyndon Johnson or Franklin Roosevelt. And I'm trying to pick people, across the spectrum. Abraham Lincoln's a party guy. He loves politics, and he understands. He creates a party. And that's what you get distinctly about Madison. He's not a pure political thinker. He's a Paul. We got to judge him as a Paul. And sometimes he kind of disappoints us because, and this is what we're seeing right now today, Kevin McCarthy versus Lynn Cheney or Lindsey Graham. Do you go with what's in the short-term interest of the party to keep the base, or do you say, even if it goes against the party, there are certain core principles that we have to abide by as a matter of conscience? That's the kind of thing that you will not understand if you think these guys are pure, especially Madison is a pure theorist as opposed to a political actor.
Well, on that note, which is both a front note, but maybe also a hopeful note, because on the one hand, we're saying, well, Madison, he was a politician. But on the other hand, we're saying politicians can be like James Madison. So let's end there. Professor Akhil Amar with this terrific book. Thank you. Thank you, Louise Mirror. Thank you, New York Historical Society. Have a good night.